I've been a search and rescue volunteer for 11 years. I want to start there because it matters for how you understand everything else I'm going to tell you. I'm not someone who scares easily. I'm not someone who jumps at shadows or lets his imagination run away from him in the dark. I've pulled people out of flooded rivers, found lost hikers on mountainsides in the middle of the night, worked recovery operations that I won't describe in detail because some things deserve more dignity than a story on the internet. I've been in the dark, in the cold, in situations where the margin between finding someone alive and finding them not was measured in minutes. I know what fear is. I know the difference between fear that means something and fear that means nothing. The kind that's your body reading the environment correctly and the kind that's just your nervous system misfiring in the dark. What happened on the Hatchett River the night of March 8th was the first kind. My name is Daniel Voss. I'm 42 years old. I live in a small city in western North Carolina called Caldwell Falls, and I've been volunteering with the Caldwell County Search and Rescue Unit since I was 31. Before that, I was an EMT for 6 years, and before that, I spent 4 years in the Army, 2 of them overseas. I tell you this not to establish credentials, but to establish context. I am not a man who frightens easily, and I want you to hold that the whole time I'm talking. The Hatchett River runs through the western edge of Caldwell County, dropping out of the Blue Ridge foothills and cutting through a section of River Gorge about 12 miles long before it flattens out into the valley. It's a beautiful river if you're a kayaker or a fly fisherman, technical and cold and fast in the upper sections. It's a dangerous river if you're not paying attention, or if the water is up, or if you're out there after dark and you don't know the terrain. We got called out to the Hatchet maybe 4 or 5 times a year. Missing hikers, overturned kayaks, occasionally someone who'd driven a vehicle off one of the narrow roads that ran along the gorge. Standard stuff, the kind of call-outs that the unit handled efficiently, professionally, without drama. The bridge at mile marker 7 was a different situation. Let me tell you about the bridge. It was a single-lane iron bridge, built in 1931, that crossed the Hatchet at its narrowest point in the gorge. Old enough to be on the county historical register, which meant it couldn't be demolished even though the road it served, a county road called Harrow Road, had been effectively abandoned since the 1970s when the state built a new highway several miles to the east. The bridge sat at the end of a half-mile stretch of deteriorating asphalt that came off a rural route and led nowhere except to the bridge itself, and then to a Forest Service road on the other side that connected to nothing useful. Nobody drove Harrow Road anymore. The pavement was cracked and reclaimed by grass in the middle. The bridge itself was posted with weight limit signs that made it illegal for anything heavier than a passenger vehicle to cross. And on the other side of the bridge, the Forest Service road was gated and locked most of the year. But people walked it. Hikers used the bridge as a crossing point because the river was otherwise uncrossable for several miles in either direction without a boat. Fishermen parked at the Harrow Road turnoff and walked down to the bridge and across to fish the other bank. Teenagers came out there at night because teenagers go to remote places at night, and that's just a fact of geography and adolescence. And occasionally, maybe once every couple of years, in the unit's records going back to the 1990s, someone went to that bridge and didn't come back. Not every one of those was a tragedy. Some were runaways found later in another county. Some were people who'd gone to clear their head and just kept walking. Some were accidents. The river was fast and cold, and the bridge railing was old iron and not entirely trustworthy. But not all of them had clean explanations. I knew the bridge's history in the way you know the history of a place you've worked around for a long time, generally peripherally the way you know a colleague's reputation without knowing the details. I knew the unit had been called out there more than anywhere else in the county on a per-mile basis. I knew there was something that the older members of the unit called the Bridge File, an informal collection of call-out reports and notes going back decades. I'd never read it. I should have read it. The call-out on March 8th came in at 11:47 p.m. Missing person, male, 26 years old, named Kevin Marsh. His girlfriend had reported him missing after he'd left their apartment at 9 p.m., saying he was going for a drive to clear his head after an argument. His car had been found at the Harrow Road turnoff, locked, keys on the front seat, wallet and phone inside. I was the third person on scene. Unit leader was a woman named Greta Hollis, 15 years with the unit, as steady and competent a person as I've ever worked with. The other early arrival was a guy named Pete Dumas, about my age, who'd been with the unit almost as long as I had. It was cold. March in the mountains is not gentle. Low 30s, wind coming down through the gorge, light rain that was thinking about becoming sleet. We geared up at the turnoff and started down Harrow Road toward the bridge with flashlights and radios. Greta had a handheld GPS and was marking our route. Pete was on my left, a few paces back. We moved quietly, professionally, the way you do when you've worked together long enough that you don't need to talk through the basics. The bridge appeared at the end of the road in our flashlight beams. Iron arched slightly, the railing casting bar shadows across the road surface. The river was loud below it. The water was up from the recent rains, dark and fast and catching the light in moving fragments. Greta swept her light across the bridge and then along the railing and then down toward the water. She said, Kevin Marsh? Search and rescue. Wind. River. Nothing else. She said it again. Same result. Pete went left along the bank, I went right, and Greta started across the bridge, sweeping her light methodically. Standard 3-point search pattern on a water feature. I was about 40 yards downstream along the bank when my flashlight caught something on the railing. A jacket. A man's jacket, dark blue, fleece-lined, the kind you'd wear on a cold spring night, folded neatly and placed on the bridge railing. Not hanging, not snagged. Placed, deliberately set there, folded with a kind of care that felt wrong in context. I called out to Greta. She came back across and looked at it. She didn't touch it. She photographed it with her phone, called it into dispatch, and we tagged the location on the GPS. Then she looked at me and said what we were both already thinking. When someone leaves a folded jacket on a bridge railing over a river at 11 p.m. in March, it means a specific thing, and that thing is not good. We spent the next 3 hours on the river. More unit members arrived. Eventually, we had 9 people on scene. We searched the banks downstream for a mile in each direction. We had a boat in the water by 1 a.m. We put a drone up when the rain let off enough to fly it. We found nothing. No Kevin Marsh. No sign of entry into the water. No footprints in the muddy bank that would tell us he'd gone in. Just the jacket on the railing and the fast, cold river underneath it and the night pressing in from the gorge walls on both sides. Around 3 a.m. Greta called a stand down for the night. We'd resume at first light with more resources, better visibility. This was standard protocol. You couldn't safely search moving water in the dark with 9 people and get good results. I was the last one off the bridge. I stood at the railing for a moment. Not where the jacket had been, that area was marked and preserved. Just at the upstream end of the bridge, looking at the water. And I heard something. Not the river, not the wind, not the sounds that a gorge makes at night, which I knew well enough to filter automatically. Something else. It was a voice, a human voice, faint, coming from the other side of the bridge, from the Forest Service road on the far bank. I turned my light that way. The gate was still locked. I could see the padlock catching the light 50 yards back, but between the bridge and the gate on the road surface there was a figure. A man, standing still, maybe 60 yards away. I said, Kevin Marsh? The figure didn't move. I said, Sir, are you Kevin Marsh? I'm with Search and Rescue. Nothing. I started across the bridge. My radio was in my hand. I clicked it twice, which was the unit signal for requesting backup, and Greta's voice came back asking my status. I said I had a possible visual on the far bank and I was crossing to investigate. She said she was coming. I was 3/4 of the way across the bridge when the figure moved. Not toward me, not away, turned slowly the way something turns when it's not in a hurry, when it has no reason to hurry, and walked into the trees off the side of the road. Just walked off the road and into the tree line and was gone. I stopped. I stood in the middle of the bridge with my flashlight pointing at the empty road and the closed gate and the trees where the figure had been. Greta arrived behind me, slightly out of breath. She asked what I'd seen. I told her. A man, standing on the road, walked into the trees. She looked at the tree line, looked at me. She said, "Let's go look." We crossed to the far bank. Greta called it in, possible subject located on the Forest Service roadside. 2 members crossing to investigate, requesting additional support. The gate was locked. We went around it. There was a gap in the chain link fence on the left side that hikers had been using for years. Standard thing. We came out onto the Forest Service road and swept our lights in both directions. The road was empty. We checked the tree line where I'd seen the figure go in. Pushed into it a little ways, lights moving through the undergrowth. No one. No sound of movement. No footprints in the wet soil that I could find, which was strange. The ground was soft from the rain, and 2 people who just walked off a road should have left something. We searched for 45 minutes. Other unit members came across. We worked the tree line systematically. Nothing. Greta didn't say I'd imagined it. She didn't say that, but I could see her calibrating. The late hour, the stress of the callout, the way the mind in darkness on a riverbank can shape shadows into shapes that aren't there. I knew what I'd seen. I didn't push it. We stood down at 4 a.m. Kevin Marsh was never found. That's the first part of the story. The part one could tell you and have it be straightforward, factual, the kind of account I could put in a unit report. Missing person, difficult search, no recovery. What happened after is harder to tell, and it starts with me doing something I probably should have done years earlier. I read the bridge file. Greta gave it to me. This was about 2 weeks after the Kevin Marsh call-out, and she'd seen something in my face when I asked about it. Something that told her I wasn't going to let it go. And so she handed me a manila folder that was thick enough to be its own small book and said, "Read it at home. Don't make copies." The bridge file went back to 1987, when the unit had been formalized. Before that, there were handwritten notes from county sheriff's deputies, photocopied and added to the front of the folder by someone who'd done the historical research. 11 incidents at the Hatchett River Bridge since 1971. 11. Some were straightforward drownings, 1 confirmed suicide, 2 accidents. The notes were spare and professional and didn't leave much room for interpretation. But 4 of them had something the others didn't. 4 of the 11 incident reports contained, somewhere in the narrative, sometimes a sentence, sometimes a paragraph, sometimes just a note in the margin, a reference to a figure on the far bank. Not always described the same way. Sometimes a man, sometimes a shape, sometimes just the word someone underlined twice by whoever was writing. But 4 times in 30 years, a search and rescue responder or a sheriff's deputy had noted the presence of a figure on the Forest Service road side of the bridge that could not subsequently be located. The earliest was from 1974. A deputy named Holcomb had written, in the cramped handwriting of someone filling out a form they found inconvenient. Observed individual on far bank approximately 2,300 hours, unable to locate upon crossing. No tracks, no evidence of entry or exit via gate. Gate remained locked throughout. No tracks, gate locked throughout. I sat with that for a long time. The most recent before mine was from 2009. The note was from a unit member I'd actually known. A man named Ray Costello who'd retired from the unit about 5 years ago and moved to Florida. The note said, crossing to East Bank at approximate 0130. Flashlight contact with standing figure approximate 50 m from gate. Figure retreated into trees upon approach. Extensive search of East Bank and tree line produced no result. No explanation. I read the file twice through that night. Then I poured myself a drink and sat at my kitchen table and thought about what it meant that 4 people over 50 years had seen the same thing, in the same place, and none of them had been able to explain it. And then I thought about what it meant that Kevin Marsh's jacket had been folded neatly on the railing. And then I thought about the voice I'd heard before I'd seen the figure. The human voice coming from the far bank. What it had said. I hadn't told Greta about the voice. I told her I'd seen someone. I hadn't told her what I'd heard before I looked up, because what I'd heard, faint, carried on the wind over the river noise, was a name. My name. Someone on that far bank in the dark at 3 a.m. had said Daniel. I called Ray Costello in Florida. I found his number through the unit's old records. Greta keeps everything, bless her, and I called him on a Wednesday afternoon, not sure what I was going to say. I introduced myself, reminded him of the unit, said I'd been going through the old bridge file and I wanted to ask him about his 2009 entry. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, "How long have you been with the unit?" I said, 11 years. He said, Then you've been out to that bridge. I said I had. I said I'd been out there 2 weeks ago on a missing person call-out and I'd seen the same thing he'd described in his note. Another pause. Longer. He said, "Did it say anything to you?" My throat went dry. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "The figure. Before you saw it. Did you hear anything?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Your name?" The room felt very still. I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay. I'm going to tell you something and I need you to not dismiss it because it sounds crazy. Because I spent 12 years dismissing it and I'm tired of that." I said, "Go ahead." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The night I saw it, 2009, March, a missing teenager. I crossed the bridge and it retreated into the trees and I searched for an hour and found nothing. And when I got back to the bridge to cross back, it was standing on my side. My hand tightened on the phone." He said, "It had crossed the bridge while I was in the trees, and it was standing at the railing on my side, and when my light hit it, it just looked at me." I asked what it looked like. He said, "Like a man, completely ordinary, middle-aged, plain, unremarkable, the kind of face you would not remember if you passed it on the street." I asked what happened next. He said, "I said something to it, I don't even remember what, something like, 'Sir, are you all right?' and it pointed." I said, "Pointed where?" He said, "At the water, pointed at the river, and then it stepped off the bridge." I said, "It jumped?" He said, "No, it stepped, like it was stepping onto a solid surface. And it went into the water and it went under and I called it in and we searched for 3 hours and found nothing. No body, no disturbance in the water, like it had just walked through." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We found the kid, the missing teenager, 2 days later downstream about a mile. She'd gone in at a different point entirely. The figure had nothing to do with her, as far as we could tell." I said, "Then what was it doing there?" Ray Costello was quiet for a long time. He said, "I've been thinking about that for 15 years. Best I can figure, and this is going to sound crazy, is that it lives there. In the bridge, or in the river, or in that piece of the gorge. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's dangerous, but I know it knows names. And I know it's been there a long time." He paused. He said, "Did it cross to your side?" I said I hadn't waited long enough to find out. Greta had arrived and we'd crossed together and searched the far bank, and then I'd stood down with the rest of the unit. He said, "Good. Don't go back there alone. Ever." I asked why it mattered whether I was alone. He said, "Because every one of those incidents in the file where things went sideways, I looked at them all, same as you're doing now. Every one of them, the person who had the encounter was alone. The ones who had a partner with them, nothing happened. The ones who were alone." He stopped. I said, "What happened to them?" He said, 2 of the 4 solo encounters ended with the responder leaving the unit within a year. One of them had a breakdown. I don't know what to make of that, except that being alone with whatever that thing is does something to a person. He said, "Don't go back there alone, Daniel." I went back alone. I know exactly how that sounds, and I knew it at the time, and I went anyway. I'm not going to dress it up with a better reason than the true one. I needed to know. 11 years of search and rescue had given me a particular relationship with unanswered questions. Every call-out that didn't end in a recovery stayed with me. Kevin Marsh, the teenager from Ray's 2009 call-out, the others in the file whose names I'd read. Something in me needed to understand what was at that bridge, what it was doing, what it knew. That is not a rational impulse. I understand that now. At the time, it felt like the only thing that made sense. It was a Tuesday night in April. Clear, cold, no rain. A weeknight, no hikers, no teenagers, no chance of running into someone I'd have to explain myself to. I drove out to the Harrow Road turnoff at 11 p.m. and parked where Kevin Marsh had parked, and I walked down the road to the bridge alone. I had my flashlight, my radio on but turned down low, a first aid kit out of habit, and a voice recorder running in my breast pocket because I decided that if anything happened I wanted there to be a record of it. I have the recording. I've listened to it maybe 30 times. I'm going to tell you what's on it. I reached the bridge at 11:22. The river was lower than it had been in March, quieter, a different character to the sound. The night was still. I stood at the upstream end of the bridge and pointed my flashlight across to the far bank and the gate and the Forest Service road beyond it. Empty. I waited. For 20 minutes, I just stood there, listening, watching the far bank. Nothing moved. The river moved. The trees moved slightly in the upper branches where a wind was passing through that didn't reach the gorge floor. Nothing else. At 11:43, I walked onto the bridge. I went to the middle, stood at the railing, looked downstream and then upstream and then at the far bank again. Still nothing. I said, feeling slightly ridiculous, "I know you're here. I've read the file. I've talked to Ray Costello. I know you've been here a long time. Wind, river." I said, "I'm not looking for trouble. I just want to understand what happened to Kevin Marsh. Nothing for a long time." And then, and this is on the recording, I've had 2 other people listen to it independently and they both hear what I hear, a sound from the far bank. Not a voice exactly. More like the quality of the air changing, a frequency shift, something below the threshold of language but carrying the shape of an attempt at language. I said, "I can't hear you clearly." The sound again, closer this time. I looked up. The figure was on the bridge, not at the far end, not approaching from the gate, on the bridge, standing maybe 20 feet from me, between me and the far bank, as though it had simply appeared there between one moment and the next. It looked like a man. Ray had described it perfectly: ordinary, middle-aged, unremarkable. The kind of face you'd forget. It was wearing clothes that I couldn't quite fix in my memory the way you normally fix details. I know there were clothes, I know the general shape of them, but the specific color or cut or any identifying feature refused to stick. Like trying to remember a dream. It looked at me. I said, "Do you know what happened to Kevin Marsh?" It didn't speak, but it moved, turned slightly, toward the downstream railing, and looked at the water. The same gesture Ray had described, pointing without pointing, directing attention. I looked at the water. The river was dark and moving fast. I pointed my flashlight at the surface downstream. Nothing. I looked back at the figure. It had moved closer, 10 feet now, maybe less. And its expression, I want to be careful here because I'm aware of how this sounds. Its expression was not threatening. It was not angry or malevolent or any of the things you'd expect from something that haunts a bridge over a dark river. It looked, if I'm being honest, sad. The specific sadness of something that has been in one place for a very long time and cannot leave. I said, "Are you what's left of someone who went into this river?" It looked at me. I said, "Are you keeping track of them? The ones who go in?" Something in its face shifted. Not a yes, not exactly. More like the acknowledgement of a question that was close to the right one but not exactly right. I stood there for a long moment, and then I did something I hadn't planned and cannot fully explain. I said, "Kevin Marsh, 26 years old. He left a jacket on the railing. Do you know where he is?" The figure raised one hand, slowly, and pointed, not at the water this time, downstream, along the bank, in the direction of the gorge. Then it stepped back, and back again, and at some point between one step and the next it was simply no longer there. I stood on the bridge alone and the river ran below me and the night was completely still. I turned on my radio. I called Greta. I know what I said I wasn't going to do. I said I wasn't going to tell her I'd gone out there alone, and I kept that part. What I told her was that I'd been thinking about the Kevin Marsh case and I had a feeling, one of those instinctive feelings you develop after 11 years, that we should do another search of the downstream bank. Extended, beyond the mile we'd covered in March. The next section of gorge, 2 to 3 miles down. Greta trusted me. That's the part that sits uncomfortably with me now. She trusted me because I'd never given her a bad instinct call before, and she organized a search of the downstream gorge for the following Saturday, and she did it on the strength of my word alone. We found Kevin Marsh on a Saturday morning in late April. He was 2.5 miles downstream from the bridge, in a section of the gorge we'd never reached in the March search because it was considered too far from the last known position. A flat shelf of rock just above the waterline, partially screened by a fallen tree. He had gone into the river that night in March and the water had carried him and he had come to rest there and the geography of the gorge had hidden him for 6 weeks. I'm not going to describe the recovery in detail. Some things deserve their own quiet. What I'll tell you is that when it was over, when we'd done everything that needed to be done, I walked back upstream along the bank alone for a little while. Not to the bridge. I stopped a quarter-mile short of it. Just stood on the bank and looked at the water. I thought about the figure on the bridge, the expression on its face that I described as sad, and whether sad was the right word for something that stood on a bridge over a river and tracked the names of the ones who went in. Whether it was grief or duty or something older than either of those words. I thought about the jacket folded on the railing, whether Kevin had put it there himself or whether something else had arranged it, whether it was a marker, a record, an offering. I thought about my name spoken in the dark. I need to tell you what happened after the recovery, because the story doesn't end there. The week after we found Kevin Marsh, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't pick up. I picked up. The voice on the other end was a woman, elderly, with the particular quality of someone who has been deciding whether to make a phone call for a long time and has finally committed. She asked if I was Daniel Voss from the Search and Rescue Unit. I said yes. She said her name was Margaret Holcomb. She said her late father had been a deputy sheriff in Caldwell County in the 1970s. I said, Deputy Holcomb. He wrote one of the earliest entries in the bridge file. Pause. She said, You've read it. I said yes. She said, My father talked about that bridge his whole life. He never put the full story in the report because he didn't think anyone would believe him. But he told me. I said, What happened? She said, He was called out there in 1974. Missing fisherman. He crossed the bridge alone. This was before your unit existed, before there were protocols, and he saw the figure on the far bank. He followed it into the trees and couldn't find it. And when he came back to the bridge, it was standing there on his side at the railing, looking at the water. This matched Ray's account almost exactly 50 years later. She said he asked it what it was. He said he didn't know why he asked that, it just came out. And it turned and looked at him. I said, Did it answer? She said, He said it spoke. He said it said, and these are his exact words. He told me this story maybe 20 times and these words never changed. It said, I am the account. I am the account. I sat with those words for a long time. She said her father had understood that to mean something specific, that the figure was keeping a record, that it stood at that bridge and knew every name of every person who had gone into the Hatchett River at that point, going back further than any human record, that it was not causing the deaths. It was not luring people or drawing them in. It was simply there, witnessing, recording. She said her father had asked it one more question. He'd asked how long it had been there. It had looked at the river, and then it had looked back at him, and it had said, Since the first one. I've turned that over in my head for 2 years now. Since the first one. Since the first person went into the Hatchet at that crossing, however long ago that was, before the bridge, before the road, before any of the names in any file anywhere. Something had been standing at that spot in the gorge and watching and keeping the account. I don't know what it is. I'm not going to claim I do. I've read enough and thought enough about it to know that there are frameworks you could put around it. Folklore, religion, psychology, and none of them fit perfectly and all of them fit a little. The thing that comes closest, for me, is the oldest idea in a lot of human traditions. That certain places have a witness. That death, in a place where it happens repeatedly, eventually accumulates into something that persists. Whether that's comforting or terrifying probably depends on who you are and what you believe. I find it, and I've surprised myself with this, I find it mostly comforting. The idea that Kevin Marsh and the others before him were not unmemorate. That something at that river knew their names and held them in whatever accounting it keeps. That they were not just lost. I'm still with the unit. I'm still a volunteer. I've been back to the Hatchet Bridge twice since that night in April. Both times with a partner, the way Ray told me to. Both times we crossed and searched and came back and nothing unusual happened and the bridge was just a bridge and the river was just a river. I haven't seen the figure again. I haven't heard my name in the dark. But sometimes on certain callouts, on certain nights when the conditions are right, cold and still and the kind of dark that has weight, I'll be on a riverbank or a mountain trail or in a ravine somewhere and I'll feel that particular quality of being watched. Not threateningly, not hungrily, just noted, logged. The way you feel sometimes like someone kind is paying attention. I don't know what that means. I know what I saw. I know what Ray saw. I know what Deputy Holcomb saw in 1974 and put in a report that he kept deliberately vague because he didn't think anyone would believe him. I know that something has been at that bridge for longer than any of us have been alive, longer than the bridge has existed, longer than any road or record or human memory of that place. And I know that when Kevin Marsh went into the Hatchett River on the night of March 8th, there was something at the railing watching, and it knew his name, and when I asked, it pointed me toward him. I've thought about that a lot, whether that's what it does, whether it waits for someone to ask, and when someone finally does, it tells them where to look. Whether every one of those unexplained incidents in the file was a moment where someone was close to asking the right question and didn't. I don't know. What I know is that I asked, and Kevin Marsh came home. Late and not the way anyone wanted, but home. That's what I've got. That's all I've got. Drive careful on mountain roads. Respect moving water. And if you ever find yourself alone on a bridge at night and something in the dark says your name, don't run. Ask it what it knows. If the story stayed with you the way it stayed with me, subscribe. I put these out for the people who drive alone at night and need something to listen to. You know who you are.